Hi, Justin from Spalted Sag Studio, and in this video I'm going to build a miter stand. So for this build, I decided to see what the domino was capable of. So I'm going to use very little screws, and pretty much everything was done with the domino. And there was definitely a learning curve on that. I struggled with the first cabinet, but by the time I got to the last one, it was pretty smooth. I designed this a little different than your traditional toe kick. I'll be standing on this to access my wood, and I was a little worried about it tilting or being knocked off balance if I did it like a normal toe kick, so I decided to make this flush. Now after building it and seeing it sit and all that, I think I would have been fine with a traditional toe kick. I also made the mistake of getting shop grade plywood, and I definitely won't be doing that again. There was a lot of sand through on the veneers, and it was moving a lot on me, so it made this kind of a little more difficult than it needed to be. So to start, I'm securing the toe kicks to the lower shelf. And the trick with the domino is to make sure that you're referencing the same plate on your domino to whatever face you're using. So here I'm referencing the top face. And I did the same thing on toe kick, and that will give me a nice flush feel to it. Now when I do the dominoes, I always make my outer ones tight and my center ones loose. And that just allows you to account for a little bit of error on your part. Even if you're a little bit off on your measurement, if they're tight, they will not go in. And you could risk breaking your plywood if you try to force it. And here I have my top plate loosened. So I'm referencing the bottom plate, not the top. The top is only there so I can make sure I'm lined up properly. And unfortunately this plywood is only 19 millimeters thick, and I'm using 40 millimeter dominoes. So going into the edge of the plywood I have to go in 25, and going into the face I have to switch it over to 15 so I don't blow through the plywood. And this is a pretty easy thing to do. It doesn't take a lot of time or effort, but it is really easy to forget. And the consequences of forgetting are ruining your piece. So next up I'll be installing my rails, and that's just to offer some support. In my original design I did not have these in, and I don't understand why I forgot about that, but I added these once I started putting things together and realizing that I needed it. Since I changed my plans and installed the rails, I also needed to cut out notches for the dividers. And this will just sit up flush against the rail, and it'll also give it a little more support. Okay, next up I'll install the dominoes for the dividers. And I think maybe in the future I'll go through more in-depth processes of how to use this and everything I learned from this build. It's kind of hard to describe some of it in the middle of doing it without focusing onto it and taking away from the build. So now that we got the frame built, we'll go ahead and install the top. And I think I got a little carried away with how many dominoes I installed on this, because the glue up was a little bit of a mess. It went together fine during the dry assembly, but I think the glue just started setting up on me and it made it a very difficult assembly. Now I may have gotten away with using this many dominoes if I would have made more of them loose, but every corner had a tight domino, and I think that's where my problems were created. Because other than that, everything seemed to go together smooth. Even when I was assembling it, everything seemed like it was lining up. It just would not budge, and I ended up having to use clamps to really pull it together. Normally it just snaps in place. And here's where I realized I had a giant mistake. I should have did all the edge banding prior to doing my dominoes. Since the dominoes relies on a reference point, and that being the edge of this plywood, I changed it. So now it protrudes the thickness of the edge banding, which is really no big deal. It's a shop piece, but it was definitely a critical error on my end. Here I'm just building a quick jig for the pegs for the adjustable shelving. Now this isn't something that was really going to last beyond this build. By the end it was pretty tore up and it lost a lot of its accuracy, so I think in the future I'm going to build another one. but I'm going to do some kind of metal insert in there so it doesn't get chewed up by the drill bits. For the center dividers, I just went ahead and drilled completely through. I have another block clamped onto the other side to prevent tear out. Now for the sides, I measured it out and put some tape on my drill bit so I didn't go too far and blow out the sides. Next I'll do the center cabinet, and this will be what actually holds the miter saw. So it's going to be about 4 inches shorter and much smaller than the one we just put together. As I'm doing the recording for this, I'm realizing it's kind of difficult to explain exactly what I'm doing for this build. So again, I think I'm just gonna go over it a little bit, and in the future I'll do a more detailed version of how to use the domino. Now the center and right cabinets are going to be a little different from the left in the fact that they have backs on them. The left cabinet doesn't have a back on it. And the reason for that is I just wanted to put longer pieces of wood in that cabinet. The right side will have plywood getting slid behind it, so that has to have a back so the plywood doesn't get bound up on pieces of wood. And really the only thing I changed was the rear stretcher. I just gave it a 1/2 inch offset, and I also flipped it 90 degrees. Thankfully I upgraded some tools for doing the edge banding. I ended up borrowing this cutter from somebody and it was fantastic. I tried finding it online, but I couldn't find it, so I ended up buying a different one, but still this thing was amazing and it made the job much more accurate. When I'm doing a bunch of dominoes like this, I kind of like to make it random. I do have them marked so that way they line up with the top, but the left and right side won't match. And I do that just so it's not possible to get it flipped around or anything. If it's the wrong way, it's definitely not gonna go. So in the first glue up, I had quite a bit of squeeze out, and unfortunately this plywood's veneer is so thin that I just ended up sanding through it trying to get the glue off. So here I'm going real light on my glue. I don't want any squeeze out, but I also don't want to compromise the structural integrity of the cabinet. So it was kind of finding the happy medium in there. And I really like the dominoes for this glue up process. Everything just snapped together, and I didn't really have to worry about clamping anything until I was completely done. And even then, for the most part, everything held pretty tight. Now there is a little anxiety to it because you're really fighting the dry time on the glue. I'm using Titebond 3, so I do have a little bit more time than with like Titebond 2, but it still felt very rushed, and I don't like rushing because every time I do I make a mistake. Here I did have to apply some clamping pressure. I had a little bit of a misalignment. It wasn't terrible, so I just pulled it together and then used another clamp to pull it in nice and flush. And I know I said you don't really have to use a lot of clamps for the dominoes. Normally that's true. This plywood, however, was moving like crazy, so I did have to apply some light pressure just to keep everything aligned while I put the top on. Otherwise it would have been a huge battle. And I don't know why, but there's just something really satisfying about putting this top on and it locking into place. Okay, so now we'll move over to the right cabinet, and I'm going to start by applying the edge banding first. And this is going to make sure that everything aligns nice and flush when I do the dominoes. I also purchased a higher end iron. This one I think was 1500 watts. It heated up way faster, and it also made the application process much easier. I didn't have to fight with it cooling down or anything like that. It was quick and easy. So it's following the same processes we used for the last two cabinets, except it's just getting a little more smooth for me now that I'm getting used to the domino. And I'm not using any specific number to measure out the dominoes. My two edges are determined by the feet on the domino, and the rest are just measured at an even number to make it nice and easy. And once I get those all measured out, I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the kick panel. And here I'm referencing the top plate. Now once I do this, I'll flip it over and I'll reference the top plate on the edge. As long as we make sure that we use the same reference point, we'll get a nice flush fit. As I go, I'll do a little dry assembly, and here's where my biggest complaint with the domino comes. These sit in real tight, and they're very difficult to get out. It requires a lot of wiggling and prying, and I feel like it just lowers the tightness of the fit as you do this and take it apart. Next up, I'm moving to the side and lower shelf joint. And because this joint isn't all the way to the edge, we're going to reference the bottom plate of the Festool. And this is very confusing at first. It took me quite a while to get used to knowing when to reference what plate and how to set it up and all that. But once you get used to it, it becomes very fluid and it's second nature. And since this cabinet is going to have dividers, I need to cut out notches for the stretchers. Now, I really wish I would have found a way to do this a little more accurate. I should have made a jig or something. It was close, but it wasn't as accurate as I would have liked it. So I'll save you the pain of watching me do another set of layouts for the, 30th time now? But anyways, since we're not doing an edge-to-edge joint again, we're going to be referencing the bottom plate of the Festool. And we need to also make sure that we're changing the depth of the cut for this, since we're going from the edge to a face joint. And a lot of this headache that comes with constantly having to change the depth is just the difference of having metric and standard measurements. It's annoying, but unfortunately they don't make a domino in standard measurements, and it is what it is. And again, I think I went a little heavy on the amount of dominoes for this. I think I could have did with about half of the total dominoes for the top. And here's where I messed up. As you can see, I switched to go down. I completely forgot to change the depth, and I went through the plywood into my table. So that was an unfortunate mistake, and if this was a customer's project, I would have definitely had to remake the top. Since there's so many corners on this piece, I'm doing 95% of the sanding prior to the glue up. And I'm also going really out of my way to make sure I don't have any squeeze out. Normally it wouldn't be too bad to clean up, but as I said before, the veneers on this are really thin, and the last couple have been a mess trying to clean up the glue and not sand through. Alright, since the glue up is pretty straightforward and we've already kind of gone over it once before, I'm just gonna shut up now and fast forward. Now that we quickly got that assembly out of the way, we can go ahead and apply a finish. And I'm just using a Danish oil. I didn't want to do nothing fancy. It's easy to apply, it's easy to repair, and it holds up pretty well. And with this Craig fence system, you have to drill your own holes, so I just used a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, set that as a base, and randomly drilled holes. Okay, so I'll use the domino to make the fence, and I'm just doing an L shape. It's quick and easy, and it'll be nice, sturdy, and I'll have plenty of room to secure it to the bench. And if you look at the piece with the dominoes in it, you can really see how much this plywood was bending on me. and I was fighting this the whole way through this project. It was definitely not an ideal situation. Now that we got that assembled, we can install the T-slots. And this is a straightforward process, there's no tricks to it. Although I did drill too many holes, I ended up running out of screws and I still actually have a 2-foot section of the stuff left. Next I'll use a straight edge and align the fence with the fence of the miter saw. As I install screws, I'll slowly walk down the straight edge just to ensure that everything stays nice and flush. Next I'll set the stop block to the edge of the fence. I'll cut a piece of wood and that'll give me a rough idea of where I need to start on the tape. Now I do want to be close, I don't want to be an inch off, but I can adjust the indicator and dial it in to be precise. And I really like the tape that came with this. It's not no cheap plastic, it's nice sturdy metal tape. It is a little hard to trim up flush and all that, but it's definitely worth it being metal. Once we get it installed, we'll dial in the indicator by cutting pieces of scrap and just slowly move it until we get an exact match. Once we do that, we'll go ahead and install the rest of the tape. Now you could have did this right away, but I just wanted to be sure I was happy with the way everything lined up before I applied it, because I only got one set of this stuff. Alright, there we have it. Now I have plenty of room for off-cut pieces, and I got a nice precise miter stand. And I did jump around a lot in this video. There was a ton of footage, and this thing took me every bit of 2 weeks to build. So there you have it in 16 minutes. As always, thanks for watching, like and subscribe.